The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom creaked open with a sense of finality, the kind that seemed to echo through generations. And as Staff Sergeant Elijah Brooks stepped into that solemn chamber, it felt less like entering a room and more like walking into history, a history scarred by silence, struggle, sacrifice, and the stubborn refusal of a nation to fully embrace the breadth of its heroes. Dressed in full military dress uniform, Elijah moved with the poise of a man who had spent over a decade living by code, discipline, and honor, a man whose boots had marched across foreign lands in defense of liberty, and whose solemn duty as a tomb guard at Arlington National Cemetery had been carried out with impeccable precision and reverence. His dark brown skin shimmered under the courtroom's fluorescent lights, a sharp contrast against the deep green of his uniform, each ribbon and medal on his chest earned through blood, sweat, and soul-tested moments of unimaginable intensity. Yet today, none of that shielded him. Today, those same decorations were under scrutiny not for their merit, but for what they symbolized in the eyes of those unable or unwilling to accept that patriotism could wear his face, speak his truth, and carry a legacy too often buried beneath the sands of forgotten battlefields. As Elijah approached the defendant's table, every eye in the courtroom followed him. Rows of soldiers, white, black, brown, sat in the gallery in silent solidarity. Some gripping photos of lost comrades, others simply bearing witness, their presence an unspoken protest. Among them were Gold Star mothers and widows, veterans from Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and even a few old Buffalo soldiers, their faces like worn leather, aged by both time and systemic dismissal. At the bench sat Judge Harold Whitman, a man whose snow-white hair and reputation had made him a fixture in the military judiciary, revered by some and reviled by others for his unyielding interpretation of tradition. The room carried a heavy stillness as Whitman adjusted his glasses and stared down at Elijah like a man confronting not just a soldier, but the disruption of his worldview. Staff Sergeant Elijah Brooks, the judge, began, his voice cold, clipped, and calculated. You stand before this court accused of violating sacred military decorum during a ceremonial guard at the tomb of the unknown soldier. Is this true? Elijah's voice, when it came, was deep, firm, and steady. Yes, Your Honor. I wore a ribbon in silent remembrance of the unnamed and unrecognized black soldiers who are buried beneath the soil of this nation, many without ceremony, without inscription, and without acknowledgement. I meant no disrespect, only remembrance. A murmur rustled through the gallery, but Whitman slammed his gavel down, silencing it. Intent is irrelevant. Action speaks, and your action undermined protocol. Military tradition is not to be politicized. Elijah's expression didn't waver. Sir, the lives of those men, those whose names were never spoken, whose medals were never awarded, whose mothers never received folded flags, are not political. They're historical, and they deserve remembrance. Whitman's face tightened, but before he could respond, a woman in the back rose, holding up a photograph of a young black man in World War I fatigues. That's my grandfather, she said, voice breaking. He died in France. They never brought his body home. We've waited 100 years to hear his name spoken in a place like this. The judge barked for order again, but the room had already shifted. The air had changed. This wasn't a trial anymore. It was a reckoning, a slow, painful unveiling of truths long buried beneath marble tombstones and national amnesia. Elijah stood unwavering. His story wasn't born the day the photo went viral, nor the moment he pinned the ribbon beneath his chest plate. It had begun long before, when he'd first taken up watch at the tomb, when he'd walked those 21 steps, in solemn silence, guarding the unknown with every fiber of his being. During one of his night shifts, he'd stumbled upon an old journal in the tomb guard quarters, tucked behind insulation in the wall. It belonged to a former sentinel from the 1960s, a black soldier who had written about his grief, his pride, and the unbearable weight of serving a nation that barely acknowledged his own father's sacrifice. That journal lit a fire in Elijah's soul. He began researching, uncovering names, units, battles, and unspoken acts of valor, erased by racism. He met with historians, read declassified reports, and pieced together a mosaic of missing honor. And then, quietly, without fanfare or rebellion, he began to wear the Rabuna strand of red, black, and green, silk tucked discreetly under his chest badge, close to his heart, not to defy the rules, but to expand the meaning of reverence. For months, no one noticed. Or if they did, they said nothing. Until one afternoon, as he stood in full dress at the tomb under a blazing summer sun, a tourist snapped a photo. The image captured Elijah's profile in stoic grandeur, his posture perfect, his eyes forward, and the ribbon just barely visible beneath the shine of his medals. That photo went viral not because of the beauty of the ceremony, but because controversy sells. Commentators divided. Some called him a hero, others labeled him a disgrace. The military, under pressure, convened a tribunal, and now here he stood. Judge Whitman glared down at him, the gavel gripped in one hand. By the power invested in this court, he declared, "I demand that you remove the Medal of Honor." Now, the courtroom gasped. A breath sucked out of 100 lungs at once. Elijah's hand moved slowly to the medal. He didn't unpin it. He cradled it, fingers tracing its edges, as though it were more than metal, as though it held the weight of all the stories still waiting to be told. He looked up not at the judge, but at the crowd, at the sea of silent sentinels, each carrying a name, a grief, a history, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them all. Elijah gently unpinned the medal, stepped forward, and laid it on the defense table, not in surrender, but in protest. "This," he said softly, "does not belong to me alone. It belongs to every soldier whose name we forgot, whose face we never learned, whose blood colored the same soil I was told to protect." The room was silent. Even the judge seemed momentarily shaken. Outside, a storm was gathering, not in the sky, but in the streets, in the media, in the hearts of a people tired of selective remembrance. Elijah didn't wait for permission. He turned, head held high, and walked out of the courtroom as quietly as he had entered, leaving behind not just his medal, but a mirror for the nation to face itself in. The trial was over, but the truth had only begun to speak. Long before the gavel dropped and the courtroom hushed at the sound of a judge, a war had already been waged in silence, not the kind fought with bullets or bayonets, but one entangled in memory, truth, and the struggle to honor the unseen, the unnamed, the deliberately forgotten. Staff Sergeant Elijah Brooks, the soldier now caught in the storm of controversy, had lived his life in service not only to the flag that flew over every battlefield he stepped on, but also to the legacy of those whose sacrifices were never given. Voice, those whose bones rested beneath soil they had died to defend. Their names never carved into marble, their stories never folded into textbooks or recited at parades. Before Elijah was a soldier, he was a boy growing up in Montgomery, Alabama, raised by a father who had worn the uniform of a Vietnam veteran and a grandmother who had once cooked meals for the Tuskegee Airmen. His house was filled with black and white, photo soldiers in faded fatigues, eyes full of both pride and sorrow, which one representing a chapter of America's history that was often footnoted or erased. Elijah grew up listening to tales not found in his school's curriculum, stories of black regiments sent to the front lines with inferior gear, of segregated units who fought with valor but returned to a nation that wouldn't serve them in diners or let them vote without harassment, of soldiers whose medals were delayed or denied because their skin was the wrong color. These stories weren't bitter, they were sacred, whispered like psalms during Sunday dinners, reminders that bravery had no skin tone and that history, when left to others, would often forget those who looked like him. When Elijah enlisted, he carried that legacy on his shoulders, even when the uniform on his back tried to pretend history was colorblind. He earned his place among the elite guards of the tomb of the unknown soldier, not through favoritism, not through family connections, but through sweat, sacrifice, and an unbreakable spirit. He trained harder, marched straighter, held his salute longer, not because he sought applause, but because he knew he wasn't just standing for the unknown. Discipline and decorum. Elijah could never shake the gnawing truth that so many were buried without names, especially black soldiers from the Civil War, World Wars, Korea, and Vietnam men who had died without dog tags, sometimes not even given proper burials. Their service omitted from official records due to clerical errors that were anything but accidental. During a scheduled rest, Abrams, a black tomb guard who had served briefly in the early 1960s before being quietly reassigned. The journal spoke of the unbearable duality of guarding America's most sacred grave while knowing that so many of his own people's graves lay. Abrams had written, "I guard this tomb with honor, but I carry the ghost of my father, who was shot in Belgium and buried without a cross." Those words branded themselves into Elijah's soul. He began researching, quietly at first, in between shifts. Then more intensely on his weekends, he discovered records, redacted files, forgotten citations, faded military correspondences, pieced together a hidden world. To systemic racism, Elijah began building a list of names units, service numbers, each entry a resurrection, each detail a thread pulling at the edges of America's patched memory. He partnered with a black military historian at Howard University, Dr. Lucille Kendrick, whose life's work had been archiving untold stories of African American servicemen. Together, they compiled what would eventually be called the Forgotten Honor Roll, a living document of silent heroes. Names whispered into forgotten corners of military legacy. But Elijah wasn't just interested in documentation. Remembrance. He spoke softly to grieving families, offering what little comfort he could, sometimes just his presence in full uniform, a sentinel not just of a tomb, but of truth. Still, he knew symbolism alone wasn't enough. That's when the ribbon came. It was Dr. Kendrick's idea, a subtle strand of fabric worn close to the heart, barely visible, yet spiritually potent. Elijah began pinning it beneath his badge during ceremonial hours, not to challenge regulation, but to expand its meaning. It was never flashy, never disrespectful. It was a prayer, a tribute, a reminder, and for months no one noticed, or perhaps they noticed but chose not to speak, until the day a tourist camera captured the ribbon in full color against Elijah's chest, and the image ignited a digital wildfire. Commentators weighed in, most without knowing the context. Is this a political protest? They asked. A breach of military decorum. Others defended him, calling him a patriot of conscience. But the system moved fast. An anonymous complaint was filed, most believed. From within the chain of command, Elijah received a summons. What stunned him most wasn't the complaint, but the cold efficiency with which the military tribunal was formed. No conversation, no inquiry, just immediate escalation, as though his dignity, his years of faultless service, meant nothing against the perceived crime of wearing a ribbon. Not in the manual. Behind closed doors, Elijah was offered a deal: remove the ribbon, apologize, and all would be forgiven. He refused. Not because he wanted to be defiant, but because to remove the ribbon was to erase the very people he had sworn to remember. And so, he stood trial. The military court disguised itself as impartial, but Elijah knew what was at stake. They weren't just judging an accessory, they were attempting to crush a statement, to silence remembrance, to reassert control over the narrative of who gets honored and who gets forgotten. And in that sacred battle between remembrance and regulation, Elijah chose remembrance. As the courtroom prepared for opening arguments, he didn't ask for pity, for support, or even for vindication. He asked only that the names be read. So, in a moment that would never be shown on televised news but would echo in every heart present, Dr. Kendrick stood in the courtroom gallery and began to recite names from the Forgotten Honor Roll. One by one, dozens, then hundreds, the names filled the room like a hymn, a crescendo of memory. Some sobbed, some bowed their heads. This was the unseen war, pinned to his spirit. He was not just on trial, he was the vessel for every soldier buried in anonymity, for every mother denied a folded flag, for every hero lost to history's selective memory. And he would not betray them, not for a deal, not for comfort, not even for his Medal of Honor. The third day of the military tribunal dawned under a sky that seemed too quiet for the storm about to unfold inside the courtroom, a stillness that belied the emotional avalanche rising within the hearts of those who had gathered not just to witness a hearing, but to confront a nation's unresolved conscience. As Staff Sergeant Elijah Brooks entered the chamber, his uniform perfectly pressed, his boots polished to a mere shine, and the solemn weight of legacy wrapped around him like a second skin. Every eye turned not merely toward a defendant, but toward a living symbol of integrity, a man who had become a flashpoint for something far larger than himself. The media's presence had multiplied since day one, camera lenses craned forward like bayonets, waiting to pierce through nuance and turn a sacred battle of principle into headlines shaped for clicks. Yet Elijah remained untouched by the chaos, walking with the same precision he had mastered during his sacred duty at the tomb of the unknown soldier. His back straight, chin raised, eyes unwavering. He carried no notes, no entourage of legal advisors whispering defense strategies, only the truth, heavy and unshakable, beating in time with the steady rhythm of his heart. Judge Harold Whitman, seated like an immovable relic of a bygone era, tapped his gavel with deliberate gravity, his eyes scanning the crowded room as if attempting to preserve control over a proceeding that had already slipped far beyond his usual script. "This court will now resume proceedings in the matter of Staff Sergeant Elijah Brooks," he said, his voice sharp and distant, devoid of warmth, a tone shaped less by justice and more by the brittle shell of institutional pride. But something had shifted. The courtroom, once subdued by intimidation and formality, now pulsed with a different energy, one of resolve, pain, solidarity, and an awakening long overdue. Along the pews sat soldiers from every war since Korea, some in uniform, some in civilian clothes, some in wheelchairs, others with missing limbs or battle-worn eyes, all drawn by Elijah's unwavering stance. A group of black mothers occupied the front row, each holding a framed photograph of a son, father, or brother whose service was lost in the margins of history. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. Their presence thundered louder than any opening argument. "Sergeant Brooks," the judge said, his voice thinning as he adjusted his glasses, "you are accused of violating the U.S. Army's uniform code by affixing unauthorized at the tomb of the unknown soldier. How do you plead?" Elijah rose slowly, turned to face the gallery briefly, his eyes meeting those of a young boy clutching his father's bronze star. In a trembling hand, then faced the judge. "With honor," he said. A hush fell like a curtain. "I plead with honor. If that is a crime, I accept the consequences." Murmurs rippled across the courtroom, but Elijah's words carried deeper than noise. They landed like nails driven into the coffin of willful ignorance. The prosecutor, a crisp, clean-cut major with medals gleaming like polished reprimands, stepped forward. "Your Honor, the regulation is clear. Any deviation from official military dress protocol, particularly in ceremonial positions of national visibility, is grounds for disciplinary action. Sergeant Brooks's choice to wear a non-sanctioned ribbon, regardless of intention, breaches the sacred trust of uniformity." Elijah didn't flinch. He stepped forward. "Sacred trust?" he asked. "Tell me, was it sacred when my great-grandfather was denied a Purple Heart after being wounded in Normandy because his commanding officer said Negroes don't get medals? Was it sacred when black soldiers were given hand-me-down equipment and used as bait during Vietnam patrols because they were deemed expendable? Was it sacred when soldiers came home and were beaten in their uniforms for simply being black and alive?" the prosecutor stuttered, caught between the safety of rules and the exposure of truth. Judge Whitman scowled. "This is not the place for social commentary," he warned. Elijah raised his voice slightly, not in anger, but in clarity. "With respect, sir, this is exactly the place. This court demands I remove my Medal of Honor because of a ribbon I wore in remembrance of the forgotten. But that ribbon doesn't dishonor the uniform. It honors those the uniform forgot." There was a stir in the back as a frail veteran rose. To his feet, a Korean War survivor who had been sitting silently, holding his late brother's dog tags. "He's right," the man rasped. "My brother died in Incheon. They never gave my mother a medal, said it was a clerical mistake." 50 years of silence was the only decoration she received. Another man stood, then a woman. Dozens followed, one by one, rising like a slow tide of reckoning until half the courtroom was on its feet, each holding proof of a life dismissed by policy but cherished by family. Judge Whitman's gavel slammed. "Order," he barked. "This is a court of military law, not a spectacle." But the room had transformed. It wasn't chaos. It was catharsis, a collective unburdening of grief, a gathering of generations, saying, enough, forgetting, enough erasing, enough gatekeeping of honor. Elijah took a breath and reached toward his chest. Gasps filled the room, not because he was surrendering, but because of the calm in his movement, the sacredness of the gesture. He walked slowly, deliberately, each step like a drumbeat in a funeral procession for the old guard of selective recognition. He approached the bench, but rather than placing the medal in the judge's hand, he turned and walked to the wall, where a framed photograph of the tomb of the unknown soldier hung. He laid the medal beneath it. "Let the symbol return to the silence it came from," he said, voice reverberating through every pew. "I don't need it to know who I am, and the brothers I remember never needed a medal to know they mattered." The silence was no longer discomfort, it was reverence. Judge Whitman's face flushed, his mouth opening as if to object, to reassert control, to summon protocol like a shield, but the words never came. His authority, once ironclad, had been outshined by moral clarity. The truth had taken the floor, and it did not yield to a robe or a bench. Outside, hundreds had gathered, veterans, families, citizens. News cameras caught snippets of the hearing through courtroom windows, and soon social media exploded with clips, quotes, and images. The hashtag Honor All Heroes began trending. Schools across the country began inviting veterans from marginalized communities to share their stories. In Texas, a retired lieutenant colonel who had long hidden his wartime journal went public. In Georgia, a forgotten black soldier's grave was restored with full honors. Act aimed at investigating and awarding posthumous recognition to historically excluded servicemen. Back in the courtroom, Judge Whitman recessed the hearing, but the damage, or perhaps the healing, had already begun. Outside, as Elijah emerged, he wasn't met with protest or shame, but with silence, a deep, respectful silence followed by the slow ripple of salutes, not because he had broken a rule, but because he had defended something higher than any code, the soul of service. That night, Elijah sat quietly at a modest kitchen table in his mother's home. Across from him was Dr. Kendrick, her laptop open to a growing database. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. A candle flickered between them, the light catching the edges of the Medal of Honor that now rested not on a uniform, but in a small wooden box beside a photo of PVT, Lionel Abrams, the forgotten tomb guard who had sparked it all. Elijah's hand hovered over the box, then withdrew. "It doesn't belong to me alone," he whispered. "It belongs to the silence we've all lived in too long." And as he looked out the window, beyond the headlines and the applause, he knew the standoff in that courtroom was never about a ribbon or a regulation. It was about memory. It was about who gets to be remembered and who is left behind. And for the first time in generations, the silence had finally been broken. In the weeks that followed, the now legendary courtroom confrontation between Staff Sergeant Elijah Brooks and Judge Harold Whitman, a seismic shift began to ripple through the very fabric of the American conscience, a long overdue reckoning stirring, in places long thought immovable, beginning first in whispers, in school auditoriums and veterans halls, and slowly crescendoing into national conversation, into protest lines and policy proposals, into boardrooms and backyards where families were suddenly speaking names they hadn't uttered in generations because history had deemed them unworthy of mention. But now, at last, the truth was thundering forward, undeniable and unrelenting, and at the center of this whirlwind stood Elijah, not as a victim, not as a rebel, but as a torchbearer, carrying light into the tombs of memory where so many had been buried without ceremony. And while he had laid down his Medal of Honor, what he had taken up in its place was something far heavier, the mantle of generational restoration, the weight of dignity long denied, and the sacred responsibility to ensure no soldier, regardless of skin color, origin, or forgotten rank, would ever again be erased from the story of this nation's freedom. But even as the world turned toward healing, something deeper and more personal was unraveling in the life of the man who had tried to silence him, the very architect of the court's attempt to reduce a life of honor to an infraction of uniform. Judge Harold Whitman, finding solace in the rigidity of law, had never been publicly questioned in decades of service. But now, every decision, every word uttered during Elijah's tribunal was being scrutinized under the microscope of public consciousness, and what began as online criticism soon swelled into investigative journalism. Then formal inquiries, as civil rights groups, veterans, advocates, and political leaders began asking a dangerous question. How many other soldiers, like Elijah, had faced judgment not based on justice, but on the deep-seated biases of a man shielded by power and unchecked precedent? And as the truth began to surface, it became clear that Elijah's case had not been the first time Judge Whitman's rulings had disproportionately impacted black and minority service members' old court transcripts resurfaced. Decisions once buried in military archives were published, and a pattern of disproportionate sentencing, dismissive language, and a blatant lack of historical understanding emerged like rot from beneath polished marble, shattering the judge's legacy in real time, leading the Military Judicial Oversight Committee to launch an internal investigation that quickly turned public as testimonies poured in from veterans who had been silenced for years, some dishonorably discharged for minor protocol deviations, while others had been stripped of medals, benefits, and dignity. And in the face of mounting evidence, pressure grew for Whitman to resign, but the man who had once sat high on the bench, whose gavel had ruled with the weight of law, now found himself staring into the mirror of national reckoning, no longer the judge, but the judged. His hands no longer steady, his words no longer feared, and while some still defended him, claiming he was merely a man of discipline, the overwhelming wave of truth eroded that defense, for what Elijah had exposed was not merely a man's prejudice, but a system's complicity, a culture that had for too long conflated tradition with exclusion, honor with silence, and law with avoidance of accountability. And so, under mounting pressure, Judge Whitman announced his retirement not with grace, not with humility, but with the brittle bitterness of a man who had spent his life defending a structure now being dismantled piece by piece, not by vengeance, but by truth. And as he left the courtroom for the final time, past the same walls where he had once declared his verdict with impunity, he passed by a newly installed bronze plaque, one bearing the inscription of Elijah's words from the day of the tribunal. "This does not belong to me alone. It belongs to every soldier whose name we forgot, whose face we never learned, whose blood colored the same soil I was told to protect." And those words, now immortalized in brass, would forever be a scar on the man who tried to erase them. But for Elijah, the fall of the judge was never the goal. His battle was not against men, but against memory itself. And while he never spoke publicly about Whitman's resignation, he continued his mission with the same quiet fire, expanding the Forgotten Honor Roll project, organizing military remembrance vigils in cemeteries across the country where tombstones once labeled unknown were replaced with names, ranks and honor restored. And in a moment of poetic justice, the United States Congress passed a bipartisan resolution creating the National Day of Military Remembrance and Rectification, dedicating a permanent museum exhibit in the Smithsonian to honor the contributions of marginalized soldiers throughout American history, with Elijah serving as its inaugural curator, not because he sought credit, but because the nation finally understood that remembrance required stewardship. And during the opening ceremony, as the national anthem played and wreaths were laid, Elijah stood beside a mother whose son had died in Korea, long unrecognized, and now posthumously awarded the Silver Star, her tears streaming as she held Elijah's hand, whispering, he always believed his country would one day remember. And as the cameras flashed and the crowd rose to its feet, Elijah looked skyward not in pride, but in gratitude, for he knew the real victory was not in headlines or ceremonies, but in the quiet restoration of dignity, in the breaking of silence, in the healing of memory. And perhaps the most profound moment came one rainy evening, months later, when Elijah returned to Arlington, not as a soldier on duty, but as a pilgrim walking slowly past the rows of graves, stopping at one particular stone, worn and modest, newly inscribed with the name PVT, Lionel Abrams, the forgotten tomb guard whose journal had lit the first flame of this movement. And Elijah knelt, rain soaking through his coat, hands clasped, heart full, whispering, "They hear you now." And as lightning flashed silently in the distance, casting brief illumination over a field of stone, it became clear that though the courtroom had tried to strip him of his medal, history had instead engraved his name into a far greater legacy, one not shaped by brass and ribbon, but by the immortal power of remembrance. And so the story that began with a command to remove a symbol of honor ended not with disgrace, but with the downfall of injustice. the restoration of truth, and the rise of a new kind of soldier, one who didn't just march for the present, but who stood guard over the soul of a forgotten past, ensuring that silence would never again be the resting place of the brave.